It is my enormous pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Márcia Lima is professor of the Department of Sociology at the University of São Paulo. She is a senior researcher at the SEBRAP, which is a very important research center called Brazilian Center for Analysis and Planning, and the Center for Metropolitan Studies, with projects linked to the Center for Research, Innovation, and Dissemination of the São Paulo Research Fund. She was a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University in 2011 and 2012, a visiting fellow at the Afro-Latin American Research Institute at Harvard in 2016 and 2017, and her experience is within the field of sociology with a research focus on racial inequality studies. She has published and supervised students in the following areas: at the University of São Paulo, labor markets, educational trajectories, race, gender inequality, and affirmative action policies in Brazil. And in addition to all this illustrious CV, very, very important, one of the leading scholars in Brazil on the questions of race, she is a very wonderful person, a dear friend, someone who wants to build deep relations to Brown University, so we're very honored to have her here with us today. She'll be speaking for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open for discussion and debate and finish around 1:15 or 1:20. So let's give a warm welcome to Márcia Lima.
Okay, thank you for the audience. And good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here again. And my special thanks to Brazilian initiatives who support my trip during this month here. And also my special thanks to my friend and Professor James Green, Leila Lenin, Jeremy Lenin, and a special thanks to Ramon Ster for this wonderful welcome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Before I start my speech, I'd like to warn you about some points. I do not intend to explain Brazilian electoral behavior because I'm not expert, thanks God. However, I believe that my presentation today can help us to understand this complicated moment in Brazil, maybe in the world, and that needs to move beyond the shocking and immediate answers for what's going on now. So I will speak as a sociologist who has studied racial and gender inequalities in Brazil in the last 25 years, although I work more than quantitative data than qualitative data, but I'm sure that the narratives and interpretation about inequalities are crucial to understand the structure of inequalities. So the purpose of this lecture is to present, from the perspective of race and gender studies, how the representation of these social markers mobilized the Brazilian election, the last Brazilian election. I'm not good on this. Okay. Yes. The questions I want to defend today are, the first one, it's not possible to analyze these elections without looking at several factors that precede this moment. So it's related to the historical configuration of inequalities in Brazil, especially in the last 15 years. So I think you have to work on this 15 years in Brazil about public policies, social movements, and knowledge about race and gender. Yeah. There is a prevailing question, a common question in the post-electoral debate: how did the minorities in Brazil vote for a candidate racist, sexist, and homophobic? I will argue that question is little limited to understand the size of the problem. So the first one is the poorest people support Fernando Haddad in the second turn. Fernando Haddad from Worker Party, as you know. And also the second point is the social change and the dialogue with social movements were reduced even during Workers' Party government. That's how the problem started. So, and the narratives on race and gender have always been in dispute in the public debate in Brazil. Racism, machismo, homophobia, and especially the violence are the structure of Brazilian society. we can't talk about Brazil without look at this question, especially violence. Brazil is not, it's a nice, Brazil is a very violent place. And you could see this in the last election. And I base this article and social media, images, collections, newspapers, magazine, and blogs about this question. I need to warn you because there is some disgusting and disgusting images and the kind of disrespectful image I need to show you. So let's start. So the outline of this presentation, going to talk first about the background. I think it's very important to understand what's going on before what's happened before the election. So the changes in the Workers' Party mandates, the gender race bias in the impeachment process. The second point is about the narrative on the election and its results. Considering two specific points about this. The first one is a theoretical debate about inequalities versus difference. When you talk about public policies, when you talk about what kind of proposal we have to understand both inequalities and difference. And I'm going to work on the idea of the homeland above minorities and God above the state. That's the Bolsonaro's campaign, how do you say, título, no? Slogan, yeah. And my final remarks will be about what we have learned in this process, because it's a kind of attempt to talk about hope, but I'm not sure you can talk about fear or hope. But let's see. So Brazil has experienced in a short period between 2003 and 2013 improvements on race and gender inequalities, and excellent economic moments associated with social inclusions policies that recognize the particularities of the most excluded groups. As you know, Brazil had a good moment in the recent past. And I'm going to show you the most important things for this debate. And the recognition of quilombos, the holdovers, legislated by Constitution of 1988, this regulation affects privilege because they affect the land distribution. And the law that made the teaching of Afro-Brazilian and African history compulsory in the elementary school. This law changed learning, especially about the recognition of the black participation in the Brazilian history. Affirmative actions in the higher education system also affects privilege. Law against domestic violence affects the manpower and the structure of the people used to say, this is my family, this is my place, the states can't rule about my family and my private life. That's a real change when you talk about domestic violence and you put the state to regulate these relations. And also the famous Programa Bolsa Família and the expansion of these cash transfer programs that affects, this program affects the structure, the class structure. So we can see real changes in Brazil in the last 15 years. But, however, it's important to highlight something. The first one is there have always been criticism, especially from the press and the conservative side about the scope of these projects. In the case of affirmative action policies, there has always been a tense debate about the inclusion of racial criterion for these policies. And the affirmative action law, took 9 years to approve. And the racial equality statute took 7 years to be approved. So it wasn't an easy process. It wasn't a welcome process. So we always had the conservative side, the press, and the Brazilian elite against these policies. So it's very important to remark. But also, however, some points, and I think that's, in my opinion, one of the most important, I don't know, explanation, but can help us to understand why people, young people, black people, voted for Bolsonaro, because some aspects in this society, in Brazilian society, haven't changed during in the last 15 years. Let's talk about violence. I have some data for you about the variation, the homicide rate in Brazil between 2005 and 2015. So that's the rate, the increase. Né? The total homicides in Brazil increased about 10%. For black people, 18%. For white women, for white people and others in these discussions about indigenous and people in Asian descendants, it's a very, very, very small group in Brazil. It's less than 1% of the population. So you used to talk about white people, but it's include this group. Decrease 12%. The homicide rate for just for women increased 7% in this period. For black women, 22%. And for white and other women, decreased 7.5%. So you can see how racial violence in Brazil works, okay? And that result of this rate in this period is the PT Work Party period. It includes Lula's government, Dilma's government. So it's very important to highlight this because they couldn't change this scenario about violence, especially about racial violence. And the opposite side used this during this campaign. Bolsonaro said all the time, they do nothing about violence. So I want to solve this problem. You know that's not real, but as a discourse during the electoral campaign, it was a very, very important thing to do. So it's a bad results. And even we considering in the same decade that Brazil managed to promote the entry of over 1 million black youth in the higher education, we have these numbers. These numbers increase a lot. The violence, the death of the young black in the country, and domestic violence, homicides. So there is no reduction of violence, especially racial violence. And even we considering the higher education, the dropout rate between 2010 and 2015 was 49%. So even affirmative action worked well to put the students in the university, but they didn't work well to keep these students in the university. So that's the reason you have I think I'm sorry, things can be an answer for this. Why people voted, not voted to Fernando Haddad? Yeah, I think that's a very important thing to think about. We need to think about these results. So, okay, let's talk about the last PT mandates with Dilma Rousseff. Dilma Rousseff government had an ambiguity that cost her a lot in political field. At the same time, it creates progressive projects. They must be close to the National Congress conservative forces. In its second term, it adopted a more liberal agenda, despite of its commitment during the electoral campaign. Between 2011 and 2016, Dilma Rousseff had 119 ministers. Few of them for just days. That's crazy, but 119 ministers. And among this number, 18 women, 2 black women, and just 1 black man. So Considering this, the proportion was 15% of women and 2.5% of black people during all her government. And also we have ambiguity in her approach considering the social issues. 2012, Brazil approved the racial courts by Supreme Court and the National Congress. 2013, approved the civil gay marriage. 2013, adoption of domestic law to protect domestic workers. But between 2011 and 2012, Marcelo Crivella, current mayor of Rio de Janeiro, thanks God. That's I think I don't need to explain Marcelo Crivella, but it's the worst mayor in the history of the Rio de Janeiro. And member of Evangelical Church, was a minister of Dilma Rousseff. 2011, Dilma Rousseff gave a presidential veto to anti-homophobia kit. This kit is not a big deal. This kit was a courseware to work on homophobia, in the classroom and the school environment to seeking to reflect, understand, and confrontation the bullying against gay kids and against the idea of to be gay. Yeah? And this kit appeared again during the electoral campaign, but this kit never existed they never distribute nothing about this material because Dilma Rousseff gave a presidential veto for these documents. 2015, Aldo Rabelo became a Minister of Science and Technology. And for the first time during the PT's government, we had no specialist in science and technology in this position. And Rabelo used to say that science of the global warming was a doctrine of faith. So it's not about Bolsonaro's government. We heard this before in Brazil. The worst thing I have, in my opinion, for the social movement in Brazil, and it was the anti-terrorism law in 2016, due to the World Cup, and after the World Cup and the Olympics in Brazil, they approved the anti-terrorism law that has been used to combat social movement, especially against the landless movement. Movimento Sem Terra in Brazil. It's a very, very strong and powerful movement. It used to be a very strong and powerful movement in Brazil. And so, this second term of Dilma Rousseff faced an extremely conservative National Congress elected to confront the agenda of race, gender, and sexual orientation. The question here is to point out the right turn began before 2018 elections through the Congress support and also through Brazilian society. So especially the debate about abortion, about guns, about death penalty, that always, we always have this conservative agenda in Brazil. And Dilma faced a lot of extreme prejudice because she's a woman. So, Dilma Rousseff could be masculine when they want to describe her as a bossy person. He could be feminized when they try to describe her as a dumb. Or Dilma had two nicknames, Dilmão, like Big Dilma, to brand her as aggressive person, and also Dilmãe, like a Dilmother, to praise her. It's not accomplishment, but Dilmãe is a cute thing about Dilma. So that's very, very, very sexist way to refer to our president. So it's common in the studies about stereotypes, especially considering we use more negative approach when you become stronger in the conflict situation. So the appealing to social markers like gender, race, territory, nationality is always a way to reinforce the stigma. In the Brazilian society, it's not different. So I'm going to show you some illustration about this what's happened to Dilma. It's a very offensive and aggressive language to refer a president. This first picture is about the protests against the cost of the fuel price. People bought this car sticker and put this in the place you have to put the gas. And we have a picture from Dilma. It's an open leg. It's a very sexy clothes. And people bought this. People put this on their cars against the fuel cost. And also you have this pro-impeachment protest. It was called Balança essa quenga que ela cai. Some people can doubt and can help me to translate this. It's chuck the beach, she fall or something. Use the expression to talk about fruit in the tree, you know, Jimmy?
The fruit will fall. In this case, you shake the bitch and she'll fall.
Yeah, that's the translate about this. Very sexism protest against Dilma. We also has this picture from Jornalistas Livres. They registered some moments during the protest, the impeachment protest. So they have this picture here is very, very representative about this process in Brazil. So you have white people in the Brazilian soccer player shirts and you have the black and poor people watching these people going to the protests. So it's not no party. Some people read this image like they weren't completely disconnected of this process because they're not politicized. No, this protest is not about poor people. This protest, the impeachment, it was a elite process, you know. And the other famous picture is this couple using their green and yellow shirts, and his domestic work, their nanny, going to the protest with uniform to take care of their kids during the protests. And also we have this image. For me, it's the most aggressive image because there is a Dilma Rousseff. This face is it's Mussum. Mussum used to be a very famous comedian in Brazil, and he passed away a long time ago. But Mussum used to play a drunk guy. His character is about to live in a slum in favela. He was poor, drunk. He couldn't speak Portuguese well, and because he doesn't speak well, he has a kind of accent to say this forever is Dilma Rousseff is a kind of joke, and they use the image of this guy, and there's also a very offensive way to refer to Dilma Rousseff. Dilma Rousseff only in the asshole. That's the translation. The translation you can use here. So you can see that's a racist and sexist manifestation against Dilma, against poor people, against black people. And also that the discussion about this picture was large. What's happened in this picture? They are passive people. They don't connect with the protests against PT and Dilma Rousseff. Now, that's a very, very interesting thing. We need to think about all this background, all this process. So the race and gender agenda produced a conservative and violent reaction in Brazil, especially in this last election. The Brazilian state, especially during the Lula's government, acted as a promoter of this agenda, but a little but here, they had to negotiate and begin to change the course of the policies. This change produced tensions, setbacks, and frustrations that needed to be addressed long before 2018. And also corruption economic crisis and the increase of conservative forces in the Congress and inside the PT government were a very, very important point to understand the Brazilian election process. Let's talk about the election. That's my point. We can't just look at the last 6 months in Brazil to understand what happened. So, the first thing we need to talk when we talk about policies and gender and race, the idea of inequality versus difference. So, we have a very famous sociologist in Brazil. He passed away about 5 years ago. Flávio Pierucci wrote a book called The Trap of Difference. And in this book, his argument was that only conservative people defend the idea of difference. He drew attention to the dangers of the left side in adopting speech celebrate the difference. Pierucci called this phenomenon as the perverse effect of difference. According to him, there is enormous difficulty to follow to the end the postulate of different groups without reinforcing discriminatory practices. And my criticism about Pierucci's argument is that the idea of trap can work as well in the equality statement. So, the same discourse about inequality historically has always included some more than others. Black, women, natives, gays, foreigners, they are as always these minority groups. They never was part of the idea of equality. So we can talk about the trap of the equality as well. So in this sense, I prefer to call the paradox of difference. Okay, the discourse of difference can be used to exclude, but it can be used to seek social justice and equality for traditional excluded groups. The challenge is to use the idea of difference without hierarchizing it. So it's very, very important to understand when we talk about difference. Okay, so we need the policies for women, we need the policies for black people, we need the policies for LGBT. So, but they are different? No. The idea is they are equal. So we need to include these people by the equality, not the idea of difference. It's a huge debate, the electoral debate about this question. So considering this, I'm going to start to talk about the Bolsonaro. And during the election campaign, we saw the distortion amidst the narratives on difference. The main candidates, Bolsonaro and Fernando Haddad, addressed the issues in the opposite ways about the idea of difference. I brought a tweet from a post posted from a famous soccer player in Brazil, Rivaldo, and who supported Bolsonaro. Rivaldo is a black man and from the Brazilian Northeast, the poorest region in Brazil, and he posted a Bolsonaro's quote to endorse it. So the idea that the quote, the real problem of Brazil, economic crisis, employment, violence, health, education, and corruption. That's interesting because they thought the real problems. So you have to, that was a debate in Brazil. You know, what's matter? What's really important to change in Brazil? So, so the real problem is a very important idea in this debate, and also what do they discuss in this election? They, it's a very, very distance, you know, trying to create an idea of they. So they don't care about real problems. They care about ideology, machismo, racism, rand, feminism. That's the point. So that's the opposite. So what's real problem, what's not real problem. And they say, understand one thing. You choose a president, not a father. That's a very masculine power, you know. That's not a father. That's the idea of. So we need him to solve the problems of your country and do not teach us values. We have to learn at home and at school. And the final sentence is amazing. If we had to learn values with the president, today we would be in prison in Curitiba, talking about Lula. So, okay. So there's the idea. You can, it's not important to talk about gender, race, racism, like. That's the reason the Bolsonaro quotes about black people, about women, most of people who support her said it's not important, like, he can think like that, but he's going to solve the real problem in Brazil because race, gender, it's not a real problem. This is a very traditional conservative approach. If you look at the idea of the minorities became, the about minorities became ideologies and no real thing. Two Bolsonaro voters wrote an article for a magazine, InfoMoney. It's a financial investments magazine, very conservative magazine. And they state that anti-Petism against the Works' Party was not only because of corruption. And he said, the general weariness that people are feeling about ideology results in a desperate desire to return to a common sense. The idea of the common sense, the common man, the average, forget these special things, forget these details about race, gender, and stuff. These are the famous quotes from Joseph May in the end of the 19th century, the 18th century. That's a very famous quote in the debate about conservative thought, that now there's no such thing as in the world as a man. In the course of my life, I have seen Frenchmen, Italians, Russians, but as a man, I declare that I have never met him in my life. If he exists, I certainly have no knowledge of him. So it's two centuries pair this both quotes, but they think about what are we talking about when we talk about the idea of conservative thought. This is the conservative thought. Real things, no ideology, no manhood, no human rights. So it's a very, very distant way. We need the real change, the real experience. That's the point who I think the Bolsonaro campaign used it a lot. And how we know the slogan of the campaign is very, very interesting to understand race and gender as well. Brazil above all else, God above everything. Brazil above all else. There is a clear deconstruction of the other that undermines the idea of difference as a producer of inequality, and also undermines the idea of inequality as a state responsibility, because they invoked again the idea of meritocracy. Eliminates the difference surrounding an artificial and nationalistic Brazilian like a racial democracy discourse. So when we talk Brazil above all else, that's the same discourse in the racial democracy discourse. And God above everything, it's about a moralization of sexuality. Female behavior has a strong appeal in the Brazilian society, and as the same way it happened here in the Trump's election, fake news. Most of the fake news against PT, against Fernando Haddad, was moralization of gender, race discussion. I forgot to check this. I don't know if it's going to work. Okay. Do you have another? Mozilla. Okay. I can. I forgot this story. That's very fun. That is a
Aqui, ó, vocês que votam no PT, essa aqui é a mamadeira distribuída na creche. Olha a marca aqui, ó, tá vendo? Distribuída na creche para seu filho, ó, com a desculpa de combater a homofobia, ó. Olha o bico como é, ó. Tá vendo? O PT e a Haddad prega isso para seu filho, ó. Seu filho de 5, 6 anos de idade vai beber mamadeira na creche com isso aqui, ó, para combater a homofobia. Tem que votar em Bolsonaro, rapaz. Bolsonaro que é para fazer o filho da gente homem e mulher. O PT e Haddad, Lula, Dilma, só quer isso aqui para nossos filhos, ó. Isso faz parte do kit gay, ó. Invenção de Haddad, viu?
So, a fast translation is the part of the bottle baby is part of the kit gay, and he said the PT government distributes this in the kindergarten in Brazil, in São Paulo especially, and if Haddad win the election, all schools in Brazil will receive this bottle baby with the spinnies in this. This video had 3 million access in 48 hours. So I can explain you how people can believe in this, but it happened. It was very, very. I'm just trying to show you. It's an example about fake news and the moralization of the sex. And I'm finished. So the man who stabbed Bolsonaro was affiliated with the PT, appears in the photo of Lula. It's a completely how do you say montagem de foto? Manipulated photo. And Haddad defends the incest and communism in his books. And if Haddad comes to the power, he intends to legalize the pedophilia. So that's what the fake news. But okay, fake news are fake news. But my point here is to highlight what kind of fake news they selected to bring more vote for them. So that's the point. What kind of fake news they decide to use? And the last question I have to show you that the electoral results. So first of all, it's not, we have again 55 and 45% of votes. It was the same result we had in Brazil and Dilma Rousseff in the last election, 2014, and the result was 48 for Dilma and 51 to Dilma and 48 to Aécio Neves. So it was very, very, very close result. If you look at the tendency, the trend, PT has started to lose, to lost their votes in the last election. No? And that's the map of the election in 2014 and the map of the election of 2018. So you can see there is no big change. There is a big change because at time PT lost the election. But you can see that's the same pattern of votes. And the change was here more than the Northeast is still more PT. The South and Southeast is still more against PT. So we have change, of course, because PT lost, but it's not a real big change in terms of votes. About the white people, considering the proportion of white people in the cities and the votes. Here's the vote in Haddad, in Bolsonaro. If you consider the most white people cities, the Bolsonaro voters was higher and lower in the few black white people and higher there. And here you can see the Haddad vote So racial matters in the vote. It was important for the votes. The same tendency you can see for wage per capita. Poor people vote more to Haddad. You can see this poor people here and poor people here. So poor people didn't vote to Bolsonaro. Until the two minimum wage salary, it was PT vote more than Bolsonaro. And the famous debate about religion, I'm finished. You have the last poll before the election. They actualized this data for the census in 2010. So you can see evangelical voter, it was bigger. That's the only one that have a very different vote for Bolsonaro, but also 31% of the evangelical people voted to Bolsonaro. So, Haddad, sorry. So it's important to this vote here because you can see that all evangelical people are conservative. Just the evangelical people are conservative. And Haddad won in spiritists, not religion, atheist and agnostic people. And the Catholic voters was very, very equilibrated considering the half-half. So we have a distortion here in evangelical vote, but it's not enough to explain what's happening in election in Brazil. We need to look more. We need to. I think there's a very interesting research agenda to understand the race and vote in Brazil. We don't have this tradition in Brazil to understand the vote by race, and I think this result show us that you need to work more, to research more on race, religion, and vote in Brazil. What we have learned about this question? I'm really finished, Jim. Nancy Fraser has a discussion about recognition versus redistribution, and the point for her, in her book is just requires social arrangement that permits all members of society to interact with another one as a peers. So that's the fundamental idea to talk about justice, is considering other people as a peers. No? Two conditions is very important for this. One objective condition about the economic way and the distribution of the material gains in the society. If we don't have equality, material equality, we don't have the parity of participation. And intersubjective condition precludes norms to depreciate some categories of people and the qualities associated with them. That's what happened about gender, about race, and about gay people in Brazil. So we don't consider them as a peers. Brazilian society doesn't consider them qualified people to represent them, to occupy space in the power decision in Brazil. So my point is, my understanding about this is the last 15 years, we could see in Brazil great investment about political participation, a very low investment in the political representation. So, and if you consider the Marielle Franco death changed this debate, reverberating the electoral agenda. More black women were elected in the state assemblies in the National Congress. There were 52 transsexual candidates across the country. And the country that kills most transsexuals in the world elected Érica Malunguinho, the first elected trans in Brazil. But also you have to look at the representation of the black people and women in the Brazilian National Assembly, the deputies. White parliamentarians represent more than 70% of the seats. Blacks occupy only 3.5% of the seats, and the women occupy just 8% of the seats. So it's very important we change this scenario in Brazil, and we need to do more about more participation, more political representation than in this space of power and the space of the decision. We have here a very interesting graph about the candidates in Brazil. There's the proportion of women, and it's the proportion of the Black, Indigenous, and Asian descendants in Brazil. So we can see here the 40% is the most you have for Black, for women, and below the 50% for the only parties who have more than 50% Black was this Rede, PMN, PSOL. PSTU is a more inclusive party because they have almost 40% of women and more than 50% of Black candidates. Okay, PT is here. PSL, the Bolsonaro party, is here. PSDB is here. It's a very, you can explain a lot about PSDB in this election. So I just show you, because we need to talk more about representation, not only participation. So my final remarks are this. So conservative resistance have always been part of the Brazilian society. The question of race shifted to individual behavior. So Bolsonaro's race speech was not considered a real threat. His position about race quotas does not differ from that a good part of the Brazilian population. Gender and sexuality have always been considered a threat for families, to families. Reproductive rights and sexual orientation became considered inappropriate behavior. And Bolsonaro always says this, the minority must follow the majority. It's not a minority or majority as a demographic way, but in a behavioral way. And the escalation of the dispute is a consequence, in my opinion, of the growth of feminism, Black and LGBT movement, among other things. Thank you so much. Sorry to...
Thanks for a fabulous presentation. Some people need to leave because of classes. This happens at this time, so people feel free to leave. But we're going to take questions in blocks of 3. So 3 questions, and then Márcia will answer, and then we'll have another. We can go until about 1:15. So first round of questions. 1, and then 2, and did you want to ask a question? Okay, yes, please.
What is the United Nations involvement in Brazil?
Okay. United Nations involvement, Nações Unidas desenvolvimento no Brasil.
So this was really interesting, and one thing that strikes me about the Bolsonaro campaign is this slogan of Brazil above else, God, I can't remember, Brazil above else, God above everything. The right in this election was able to present their message as being without ideology as kind of the natural state of things. One thing that the PT had done was present the class-based argument as an encompassing argument, as something that could likewise be natural and that the working class should have a position in society. Why is it, do you have an argument as to why the PT could never bring the issues of race and gender into that kind of more naturalizing form of hegemonic discourse that's now been reappropriated by the right as being the natural position of what it means to be Brazilian?
So, third question. I have one, if no one else has one. So, Márcia, on your chart about religion, it looked like there was a difference of 10 million votes between the evangelicals and the who voted for Bolsonaro and for...
That was the difference.
Right, that was the difference in the final result. So I think, it looks, in that chart at least superficially, the key sector that the Workers' Party didn't manage to reach were evangelical voters for many, many reasons, I think. And so the question is, it seems like morality and traditional values take a precedent over the idea of inclusion. So inclusion of Afro-Brazilians, inclusions of women, inclusions of LGBTQ, as one of the elements in the evangelical discourse of all kinds that the left could not penetrate and the right took advantage of. But if you could comment more about that, because I think the key to all this is the evangelical Christians, and that's going to be really hard because, so Those are the three questions. You want to answer those? And then?
Okay, United Nations in Brazil, we used to be, I don't know now what's going on, but during the PT's government, we did a lot of work with them. They support most of the public policies by on JACE and render agenda. They have an office in Brazil, a very important office for to support the education, especially education, public policies about education, labor market. It used to be a very good relationship, and they support all these PTs changing. They support, and if they, we work with some economic support in projects, and the partnership between government and the United Nations Brazil used to be large, but we don't know now what's going on. It's hard to know what's going on now in Brazil. I think they are going to try to keep some watch in Brazil, but I'm not sure what's going on. Your questions are 1 million questions, I think, about race and gender in the PT. I think the ambiguity of Dilma Rousseff's government on this agenda and them reflected in the political campaign. I worked with PT to elaborate the program, the PT's government program for the election, and I discussed with them the question about race, especially about racial violence. I wrote the racial equality in that program, and I tried to put more, I tried to highlight this question, but I think, and as I showed you, I think they couldn't use this more because they failed in several agenda on race and gender. So it was a tough decision to make. Okay, you can say, oh, we could work more in this agenda, but we didn't do before. So it was a hard decision to make. And I think PT campaign, they spent a lot of time to discuss corruption. That was the most fragile question for Fernando Haddad solved during the campaign. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I think they couldn't push harder this question especially because there racial violence in Brazil. The feminicide in Brazil was still heard. So I think they couldn't work. Actually, to be honest, it was always a good fight inside PT about race and gender. And really, really hard. The black movement and the feminists fight a lot inside the PT to put this agenda as important agenda. Dilma Rousseff government closed the CEPI and shut down CEPI and the women's secretary to create another minister. Dilma Rousseff, she couldn't work on the abortion agenda as the feminist group wanted, so it's not a big deal for them as well. It's not so racist and sexist like Bolsonaro, but it's not a real agenda for them. It's my experience with PT is that. Jim, yeah, 10 million votes, and it was a big difference in this election. And I think the same day we had Ele Não, not him protest, the biggest protest in every city in the country. In the same day of this protest, Bispo Macedo, the most important pastor, the big pastor of the evangelical church, he declared he supports Bolsonaro in the same day. And also, After the protest, not him, new fake news about the protest. So they used image from other situations, especially the Marcha das Vadias.
March of the Sluts.
Yeah, it was a big feminist protest against the machismo, not against any government, but women without shirts and several images, very, very shocking for conservative people. And they said that it happened in the march against Bolsonaro because they don't want Bolsonaro as president because Bolsonaro will face this kind of behavior, and it was very, very decisive in this campaign. But I think we need to work more in evangelical, because the same people, evangelical people is black, poor, live in the poorest areas in Brazil. And also, they used to be the most beneficiary people from the cash transfer program and this kind of project, this social projects. But also, there is a very, very specific thing in the evangelical way is I earn it. It's an evangelical way, theology, evangelical theology this is my merit, God and I, like this. They can recognize the government was very, very good to help me, so it's easier to change their minds about this process because they don't believe that's social program, it's just God. That's it. I think I know. So I have a good answer, but so confused, so complicated to think about it. I'm trying to figure it out what's happening in Brazil. And because I think we need to survive this, and it has been very, very hard for us. It was a nightmare, so we need to pour more rationalization in our comprehension about this.
With the evangelical, if 33% are voted for Haddad, if you really only have to win 5 million, it's not 10 million, 5, because it would have switched it. So it's there's already allies there if 33% are voting. Questions? Any more questions? One? Yes?
Thank you for the presentation, and it doesn't quite feel possible to respond to the entirety of it. And I guess my question is something like this, that is, when we think about these things, the election of a Bolsonaro or the election of a Trump or an Erdogan, because this is a worldwide phenomenon, there's structural factors, there's what social actors do. Here I'm wondering, did the left or even the left center make mistakes? That is, seems like the specter of Bolsonaro getting elected maybe wasn't taken seriously until very late, right?
Yeah.
Because the PT was going with a sort of symbolic campaign for a long time, right? Understandably, right, in holding, well, we're going to run Lula.
But they pushed too long the Lula's candidate.
And then the polls showed that Lula would have won, and Haddad was way behind Lula, and so there was always clearly a question of how will this get translated? How will Lula's support get translated to Haddad? The longer that scenario continued, the less likely, I believe, the transfer will occur, right? That is, if toward the beginning you try to make this shift, it's one thing, but if you wait till late, and then of course there's, things like Cardozo, right, and what he does in the election, and not to mention the PDT. And so I'm sort of wondering, how do we understand all these moves? Like, what did people did not think Bolsonaro was a real threat, or what was the PT thinking, and what was the rest of the left and center left thinking?
Let's see if there are any more questions. That'll be our last round. Any other questions to put on the table? One, yeah?
Thank you for a really great presentation. If I understood properly, there is some gap, like better according to does not take gender and race issue as seriously as Bolsonaro supporters do. So why it's so crucial, or why it's so easy for Bolsonaro to attack them and target them exactly in these issues? Or
Okay.
Any one last question? Yeah.
I'd like to hear about you about the system, the party systems in Brazil, because since the Supreme Court ruled that you cannot have this hierarchical structure, so actually we're talking here about a PT, but we actually have 28 PTs. Like we have one for each state and one for the federal government. And how does it translate? Because, for instance, I'm from Rio de Janeiro, and in Rio de Janeiro, PT is like quá, like it's militia, you know, like it's the most conservative thing that we can have. It's more conservative than PMDB. So, and how do you think that if we have this more structural system, do you think it would push where? PT in this moment, more to the left, more to the conservative, like we have more quaquas or more Dilmas, because I think this plays a huge role in this more national campaign.
Thank you. So I think that's we took a long time to take Bolsonaro seriously, so it was a huge mistake. And you have the knife episode about the stabbing him. And it was easier for him because he didn't participate in the electoral debate. That's crazy. And there is a discourse in Brazil now, because I'm not a politician. People don't want politician anymore. So when he stepped back on the political debate, people say that's the guy. Because, you know, like, despite the fact he has been deputy for 28 years, he did nothing. So he used his nothing thing to say, I did nothing because I'm different, because I'm not a traditional politician. So he used this a lot. I think, I don't agree the idea of PT, government PT, as a work party had, it was, the Lulismo is still alive in Brazil. They're still alive. Despite all this situation, PT has the major number of deputies in the new Congress. So it's not a bad result. Fernando Haddad had it was a pool with two scenarios, A with Lula, B without Lula. And in June, Haddad had 1% of the intention votes. The guy did well. You can't say that it was a horrible result for PT. I agree that, I think that's a very important thing. But I think they should start this Fernando Haddad campaign before, early they start. They pushed this until September 3rd. Haddad run real for a month and a half, almost 2 months maybe. So yeah, I think that was a problem. And I think that the left in Brazil they didn't work well, and now the beginning of the new mandate, they start wrong again because they didn't vote in the same way in the election for the, how do you say? Speaker of the House. So you have, Alexandre Freixo had 50 votes. That's ridiculous. So I think the left in Brazil is very complicated, and they don't agree about the gender race issue. They don't agree about social policies. So I think we have this problem. The gap and the moral. I think I tried to show you today that the PT started to turn right in the, especially the 2013, 2014, when they decided to the re-election, the Dilma Rousseff re-election, the PT changed completely its position about this serious thing about race, about gender, about inclusion. When Dilma started her second term, she put the most liberal person in the economy.
You mean the neoliberal economic policies that are pro-foreign investment? When
Yeah.
you say liberal, yeah.
Yeah. So this second term became more liberal, and it was a huge betrayal for the PT voters. People used to say it was esqueci o nome em português.
Eleição?
Não sei que lá é eleitoral.
Estelionato eleitoral.
Estelionato eleitoral.
It's kind of a electoral robbing or fraud
Yeah.
or
They
stealing.
took the opposite way they used during the campaign. You know? And they said, don't vote to Haddad, don't vote to AS because AS is liberal, AS is going to take social rights, and Dilma did this. So it was a very, very complicated situation for her. It wasn't her decision, it's not personal. It's not personal, it was a way, she needs to find a way to steal the power, and she couldn't. Despite of all right, this turn to right side, she couldn't keep in her mandate during this very, very conservative moment. So I think that's this gap. And the second part of my answer to you is, I think this gap is about moralization. They said the PT created the pedophilia, they said the PT created the skit gay, they said the PT, and Fernando Haddad decided to fight the debate against corruption. I'm not corrupt, Lula livre, and I think this 10 million vote was a result of this decision to keep this, trying to survive, and people said corruption, 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 and Haddad's moralization, Bolsonaro moralization, and the idea of moralization worked to, not only for gender, race, and LGBT cause, but also the moralization against corruption. So that was the discourse. I agree with you about the fragmentation of the, we have two fragmentations. The first one is the number of parties in Brazil. We have 45 parties. And this new Congress has I think, 33 parties. It's gonna be crazy. And that's one of the, and the other problem is how the PT changed to the right, especially in the Rio de Janeiro, that's a nightmare. And militia, and São Paulo has the same problem. Família Tato, the Tato families, they are the same like the militia or corrupt people, very violent people. I think it's a project of power. It's not more, we need to keep the power. So they created some connections with these people, and now I think they need to recreate the idea of the Works Party and maybe a new party. Because I saw several people completely, especially I came from a very countryside, and the PT used to be, my mother created the PT in my city, in our city, and in the last 15 years I look at how this guy supports PT. But this guy, how? You know, like this very, very weird. You can say about the PRB, the party from Evangelical Church, still with Dilma until 2013. So the side, the right side was in the government until 2013. And they left Dilma when started the impeach process. So PT became a little conservative. I think that's the real problem for us.
We want to thank Márcia Lima again for coming and joining us with the day.